Eleanor Marsh had lived in the same house for 51 years. She'd raised 2 children in it, buried a husband from it, and spent the last 4 years rattling around inside it like a marble in a shoebox. The walls held memories she couldn't bear to leave. Gerald's handwriting on the doorframe where he'd marked the kids' heights every birthday. The faint watercolor stain on the kitchen ceiling from the time the pipes froze. The smell of the back bedroom that still, somehow, carried something of him. But the stairs had become a problem. Then the yard. Then the grocery trips. Then everything. Her daughter Patricia had noticed first. She lived in Denver, called every Sunday, and had been gently, then not so gently, suggesting a change for the better part of a year. Eleanor resisted every conversation. She wasn't ready. She didn't want to be ready. What she didn't know was that Patricia had already found a place. Sycamore Gardens, a senior living community in Naperville, a 40-minute drive from Eleanor's house. 1-bedroom apartment, first floor, large window facing the garden. Patricia had toured it herself, spoken to the staff, reviewed the pricing, and quietly put down a deposit. She told herself she'd bring it up when the moment was right. The moment never felt right. So she simply arranged everything and then told her mother it was done. Eleanor cried for 2 days. Then she started packing. Across town, in a beige ranch house on Birchwood Lane, a man named Franklin Adler was having a parallel argument with his own reflection. He was 74, a retired civil engineer, widowed 6 years ago when his wife, Donna, passed from a stroke that took everyone by surprise, including her cardiologist. Since then, Franklin had maintained the house with the kind of rigid discipline that kept grief at arm's length. The lawn edged perfectly. The gutters cleaned twice a year. Dinner at 6 every evening, even when it was just him and a bowl of soup. His son, Michael, lived in Chicago and visited when he could, which was not as often as either of them pretended was fine. Michael had been watching his father slow down, the small things, the hesitation before standing, the way he gripped the counter now when he walked through the kitchen. Michael had done his research quietly, the way responsible children do when they're afraid of the conversation. He found Sycamore Gardens, same community, same wing, different apartment, 1B next door to 1A. Michael had toured it on a Tuesday morning, signed the paperwork on a Wednesday, and called his father on a Thursday to tell him the move-in date. Franklin didn't cry. He went outside and edged the lawn one more time, then came back inside and sat at the kitchen table until it got dark. Move-in day was the second Saturday of October. The morning was cool and overcast. The kind of fall day that feels like the world is quietly closing something. Eleanor's daughter, Patricia, drove the moving van while Eleanor sat in the passenger seat holding a small framed photo of Gerald on their wedding day, her fingers wrapped around the frame the way you hold something you're afraid of setting down. They arrived at 10:15. Franklin's son, Michael, had gotten there at 9, practical as always, wanting to get the furniture situated before noon. Franklin sat in a lawn chair in the parking lot and watched Michael direct the movers, offering no instruction and refusing to go inside until the last box was carried. Through the door, Eleanor and Patricia came around the corner of the building just as Franklin finally stood from his chair. The hallway outside apartments, 1A and 1B, was narrow and briefly chaotic. 2 sets of movers, 2 piles of boxes, 2 adult children trying to coordinate, 2 elderly people standing slightly apart from the noise like they'd both stepped out of the same quiet dream. Franklin noticed her first. He noticed the photo in her hands. Eleanor noticed him second. She noticed the way he was standing. Not lost. Exactly, but like a man who had misplaced something and was still deciding whether to look for it. "Looks like we're neighbors," Franklin said. Eleanor looked at the door numbers. 1A, she said, pointing to hers. 1B, he said. Patricia and Michael glanced at each other across the hallway for a half-second, a look that neither parent caught, before both of them went back to directing boxes. The first month was cordial and nothing more. They passed each other in the hallway, nodded, exchanged brief observations about the weather or the quality of the Tuesday pasta at the communal dining room. Eleanor kept to herself in the evenings. Franklin walked the garden path every morning at 7:15 with a precision that suggested he'd scheduled it years ago and saw no reason to change. It was the garden bench that started it. There was one bench at the far end of the walking path, positioned under an oak tree that had turned a deep, almost theatrical amber by mid-October. Eleanor had taken to sitting there in the late afternoons with a book she rarely read. Franklin, rounding the path one morning, found her already there, and since there was nowhere else to sit and his knees had begun to voice strong opinions about standing, he asked if she minded. She said she didn't. He sat. They were quiet for a while. "You're from around here?" he asked eventually. "Lived on Clover Street for 51 years, she said. "You?" "Birchwood Lane, 38 years. She looked at him. "I know Birchwood Lane. My husband used to cut through it on his bike." Franklin nodded. "Good street for biking, flat." He said the same thing. Another silence, but a different kind. The kind that meant something had been recognized. By November, they were eating dinner together twice a week. Not arranged exactly, it just happened. That they arrived at the dining room at the same time, and it seemed foolish to sit at separate tables. Franklin had opinions about coffee that Eleanor found both irritating and oddly endearing. Eleanor had a habit of finishing other people's sentences that Franklin initially found presumptuous and later quietly came to depend on. They talked about their late spouses the way people do when enough time has passed that the grief has become something you can carry rather than something that carries you. Franklin talked about Donna's laugh. She'd had a laugh that started silent, shoulders shaking before the sound came out. Eleanor talked about Gerald's stubbornness, the way he'd argue a point he'd already conceded, just because he didn't like the tone in which he'd been corrected. "That's insufferable," Franklin said. "He was," Eleanor agreed. "I miss it every single day." Franklin looked at his coffee cup. "Yeah," he said. "I know exactly what you mean." December came cold and fast. The community put up lights along the garden path, and there was a small holiday party in the common room that both of them attended separately and ended up standing beside each other at the punch table for 40 minutes, talking while everyone else danced. It was Patricia who noticed the change when she visited just before Christmas. Her mother was lighter somehow, not happy in a performed way, but genuinely quietly less burdened. She was moving around the apartment with a purpose she hadn't had in years. She mentioned Franklin's name 3 times during lunch without appearing to realize she'd done it. Patricia texted Michael that evening. "Have you noticed?" Michael replied within seconds. "He told me about her last week. First time he's mentioned someone like that since Mom." Patricia stared at her phone for a moment. "Did you know they were going into the same place?" "No, you?" "No." She set the phone down and sat with that for a long time. The strange arithmetic of it. 2 children making separate decisions out of worry and love, each one unaware of the other, and the universe deciding to make something out of the coincidence that neither of them had planned or earned or even hoped for. It was a Tuesday in January when Franklin knocked on Eleanor's door in the early evening, holding a paperback book. "I finished it," he said, handing it over. She'd recommended it weeks ago. A novel about a woman who restores old maps, and he'd resisted it for most of that time on the grounds that it sounded slow. "And?" Eleanor said. "It was slow." "But?" Franklin looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be tender and failing completely. "But I stayed up until 2 in the morning to finish it, so..." Eleanor took the book. "Come in," she said. "I just made tea." He came in. He sat in the chair by the window, the one that had a view of the garden path and the oak tree, bare now in January, its branches making clean dark lines against the gray sky. They talked until 9:30. When he stood to leave, he paused in the doorway. "Eleanor," he said, and then seemed to reconsider something, and then decide against reconsidering. "I'm glad they put us next to each other." She looked at him for a moment. "They didn't know they did," she said. "Our kids, neither of them knew." Franklin turned that over. A small smile crossed his face, not quite disbelief, not quite wonder, something in between. "Well," he said, "then I'm glad for whatever did." He walked back to 1B. Eleanor stood in her doorway for a moment. Before closing the door, holding the book with both hands, the way she used to hold the photograph, she set it on the table. She was smiling. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, soft and silent along the garden path, settling onto the bench under the oak tree, making everything look briefly, gently, like something that had just been given a second chance.
I hope this story made you cry. If this story touched your heart, so like and subscribe. Thank for watching this video. I will see you next video.